Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a specific piece of commentary. It offers a very particular take on a U.S. president's approach to terrorism and extremism.
That's right. And the source we're working from today, it's a monologue from the TV show Justice, hosted by Judge Jeanine Pirro.
So our goal here, our mission, is to really walk through this specific commentary. We want to unpack the main arguments, the observations she makes, the evidence she presents, basically to understand the perspective laid out in this source.
Yeah, understand how she constructs her argument.
Yeah.
And she gets straight to it, really. She states a very direct conclusion right up front.
Okay.
She says, after watching this president for 6 years, and especially after hearing his remarks at a prayer breakfast, she concluded he's actually comfortable with extremism.
Comfortable.
Finds it okay, is nonplussed by it,
Mm.
like it's just, part of what happens. That's her core takeaway.
Wow. Okay. That's a strong conclusion. So how does she build up to that? What specific actions or maybe inactions does she point to as her evidence?
Well, she starts with some specific moments. One example she gives is the president going golfing within minutes, she says, of announcing that an American had been beheaded.
Right. The timing there is what she focuses on.
Exactly. She sees that as significant. And she also looks at sort of his presence or maybe his absence on the world stage.
Like the event in France.
That's the one. She specifically mentions him not being in an event in France where, according to her commentary, 40 world leaders were there denouncing Islamic terrorism.
So specific actions, absences, what about things he didn't do? Perceived inaction.
Yes, that's definitely a big piece of her argument. She mentions him not attending, quote, certain funerals.
Okay.
And maybe more broadly, what she sees is a lack of strong reaction to. Well, she describes it as the wholesale slaughter of Christians in the Middle East.
And the source uses some very graphic language there, doesn't it?
It does. She talks about the raping, beheading, crucifying, and burying alive of children. She uses these really stark terms.
To emphasize the gravity of it from her perspective?
Right, and to contrast that, horror with what she portrays as the president's subdued response.
She also suggests he doesn't really react strongly even when his own red lines are crossed.
That's another point she makes, that he doesn't get excited, is how she puts it. And she gives another specific example here.
Okay.
After announcing that a coalition pilot had been burned alive, a horrific event, she says the president quickly or easily pivots to talking about health care.
So she sees that quick shift as evidence of detachment.
Yes, or at least a lack of sustained, forceful reaction. She connects these kinds of behaviors back to that main idea, his being comfortable or, nonplussed by extremism.
Okay, now you mentioned the prayer breakfast earlier. It sounds like the commentary really zeroes in on that event.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
She seemed to view his remarks there as, well, particularly revealing. The source even quotes him directly.
What did he say, according to the source?
He said, quote, "Unless we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ." He continues, "This is not unique to one group or one religion. There is a tendency be in us, a sinful tendency that can pervert and distort our faith." End quote.
And the commentator points out that these comments didn't really sit well with a lot of people, that they caused some confusion.
Yeah, she highlights that. She mentions someone named Joe Scarborough, who apparently asked something like, where did he go to church? Where would he get such ideas from?
And the source commentary immediately makes a connection there.
Right away. It connects that question straight to Reverend Jeremiah Wright. She states, very forcefully, that the president sat in Wright's church, in his pew, for 2 decades. And she specifically brings up Wright's, quote, "Goddamn America" line, as presented in her source.
So she's drawing a direct line, suggesting that's where he might have gotten these ideas, in her view.
That's the implication she draws, yes. And this whole section really feeds into her larger critique of the president's language, the comparisons he draws.
Especially that phrase, "get off our high horse."
Exactly. She really takes that phrase apart. She questions what it means in this context. Like, does condemning jihad make Americans high-minded?
And she pushes it further, doesn't she?
Yes. She asks if the president is basically suggesting Americans somehow have it coming because of things that happened centuries ago, like the Crusades or the Inquisition.
So from her perspective, bringing up history isn't for context. It's like an excuse.
That's precisely her argument. That pointing to centuries-old wrongdoing is being used, in her view, to excuse the slaughter of innocents today.
And she contrasts how he talks about historical groups versus current ones.
A very sharp contrast. She says he has no problem identifying crusaders as Christians, but he finds it hard, or seems unwilling, to identify today's terrorists, the jihadis, as Muslim.
She has that quote right. Throw a rock at Christians.
Yes. Throw a rock at Christians, no problem, but never speak of Islamic terrorists. She uses that line to really hammer home what she sees as a kind of double standard.
Or a deliberate avoidance.
That's how she frames it. A deliberate avoidance of linking today's violence to Islam, while readily linking past violence to Christianity.
And she gets into interpretations of the Quran as part of this.
Briefly, yes. Her commentary mentions the view that the Quran is interpreted by some as demanding jihad, including taxing or killing non-believers and aiming for a worldwide caliphate.
And she links that interpretation directly to current events.
Directly. She says this interpretation is what drives today's terrorists who are, quote, beheading, imposing that same jihad, and marching to create an even bigger Islamic state.
So, given all that, what does she want the president to do? Or say?
Well, her message is pretty blunt. She says he needs to stop apologizing and stop pussyfooting around with this language dance.
A call for more direct language.
Yes, what she would consider plain speaking about the nature of the threat.
But she does add a clarification right after that, correct?
She does. It's important to note. She explicitly states that not all Muslims are terrorists.
Okay.
And she even gives an example, Egypt. She points out it's, what, 90% Muslim? And that the country rose up against jihadists who were also Muslim?
So an internal distinction within the Muslim world itself.
Right. It seems like an effort within her argument to clarify that she's targeting a specific extremist ideology, not the entire religion.
Okay, so she's argued the president avoids naming Islamic terrorism, but she clearly believes that's the main threat. How does she support that specific claim?
Well, right after discussing the language, she pivots to listing specific terrorist attacks against Americans. The goal seems to be showing a pattern.
And it's a fairly long list she provides in the source.
It is. She starts with the first World Trade Center attack back in '93, then the USS Cole bombers, then the Fort Hood shooter.
And she pauses on Fort Hood, right, that label.
Oh, yeah, she really singles that out. She heavily criticizes the administration, calling it workplace violence.
Seems like a key point of frustration for her in the commentary.
Definitely. She calls that label a joke, something people can't believe. Then the list goes on. The shoe bomber, the underwear bomber, the Boston bombers.
And, of course, 9/11.
The September 11th hijackers, yes.
And after running through that list, she poses a kind of challenge or question.
She does. She asks the audience, basically, identify what other violence is being committed against Americans in the name of any other religion.
Or is it just coincidence?
Exactly. It's a rhetorical question, obviously, designed to underscore her point, that in her view, the threat is overwhelmingly coming from one particular religious context.
Which then leads into her wider critique of the administration's approach, not just language, but policy too.
Right. She hits that workplace violence label again, calling it a joke. And then she makes another claim, that the administration actually erases words out of reports identifying terrorists as Islamic.
Implying a deliberate policy to obscure the connection?
That's the implication, yes. And following from that, she makes a very direct statement about priorities.
What's that?
She says quite bluntly, stop defending Islam, start protecting Americans. That really sums up her perspective on where the focus ought to be.
And then she tackles the actual security strategy, the policy itself.
Yes, she identifies the administration's stated policy as strategic patience.
And she's critical of that.
Highly critical.
Yeah.
Her response is basically, what are you waiting for? She argues this waiting isn't passive, it has negative consequences.
Such as?
She claims that while you wait, they keep winning. And she links it to other issues, saying Iran gets closer to nuclear enrichment during this period of patience.
So linking inaction on terrorism to broader geopolitical risks.
Precisely. And she throws in a few other criticisms, too, things like opening borders, reducing the military, and she mentions him criticizing America at the UN and in Cairo.
And she wraps that section up by coming back to that initial theme.
Yeah, consistency. She says, almost sarcastically, if nothing more, you're consistent. Extremism is just a part of life, reinforcing her core conclusion about his perceived comfort level.
Okay, so she's laid out the case based on actions, words, policy. What does she describe as the actual impact of all this, the danger for Americans right now?
Well, she brings in something she attributes to the FBI director, a statement about the Bureau having open ISIS-related investigations.
Where?
In virtually every state but Alaska. She uses that to really drive home that this isn't some distant threat. It's potentially everywhere, according to this claim.
And she ties this back again to the president's attitude.
Directly. She argues that the president's actions, his statements, his personal behavior all suggest that, quote, none of this is a big deal.
Which she believes makes the situation more dangerous.
Yes. And she makes another strong claim related to this. She suggests that the terrorists themselves perceive this.
How so?
She claims that even ISIS sees that Americans seem desensitized to beheadings, and that because of this perceived desensitization, ISIS felt they had to escalate,
To the pilot being burned alive.
moving, as she puts it, to the almost unimaginable burning someone alive. She links that escalation directly to a perceived lack of reaction in the U.S.
And what does she say is the result for ordinary Americans? How are people feeling, according to her commentary?
She paints a picture of significant public distress. She says Americans are angry and frightened, and that for many people the fear is overwhelming.
So she connects the administration's approach, as she sees it, directly to public fear and anger.
That's the emotional consequence she describes, yes.
And how does she end the commentary? What's the final thought she leaves the audience with?
It's sort of a mix of hope and fear. She says she hopes the only solution isn't just waiting for a real leader in 2016.
But there's a caveat.
Yes, she immediately follows that hope with the fear that by 2016, quote, it won't be too late.
It's a pretty stark warning to end on. Okay, so to recap this deep dive, we've essentially walked through, step by step, one specific and a very forceful critique of a U.S. president's approach to extremism and terrorism.
Right. We focused only on the arguments, the evidence, the specific points raised within that single commentary from Judge Jeanine Pirro's show, Justice. The goal was just to understand her perspective as presented in that source.
Exactly. We're just laying out what the source material contains. And as you think about this particular viewpoint, especially how much emphasis the source puts on language, on comparisons between historical events and current threats, here's something to maybe mull over, drawn from these themes. How does the specific language we choose, the words used to describe history, the words used for threats today, like we heard discussed in this commentary, how does that language actually shape our understanding and maybe even shape our response?